At the end of the First Age of the world, when the long and catastrophic struggle between the powers of the West and the first Dark Lord had finally come to its apocalyptic conclusion, the world stood wounded, reshaped, and forever altered. And it was in this fragile moment, balanced between ruin and renewal, that the island of Númenor was conceived, not as a conquest or an accident of geography, but as a deliberate act of grace, a reward granted to the race of men who had chosen fidelity over fear in the darkest hours of history. For during the War of Wrath, when the hosts of the Valar crossed the sea and broke the power of Morgoth in a conflict so violent that entire lands were shattered and drowned, it was the Edain, the noble houses of men who had long fought beside the elves against overwhelming evil, who proved themselves steadfast beyond expectation, and though many of their kin across Middle-earth had fallen into shadow, servitude, or despair, these men had resisted corruption, offering loyalty not for gain, but out of shared hope. And it was for this reason that, when Morgoth was finally cast into the void and the First Age ended in fire and grief, the Valar sought to honor them with a gift unlike any other, a land set apart from the sorrows of the hitherlands, raised from the sea by divine power and placed closer to Aman than any mortal realm before it, yet not within the undying lands themselves, for the gift was never meant to erase the fundamental nature of men, but to ennoble it within its limits, and thus Númenor was created as a bridge between mortality and immortality, between the fate of men and the memory of the West, shaped in the image of harmony rather than dominion, and offered not as a promise of eternal life, but as a space in which the Edain might flourish, grow wise, and accept their destiny with dignity. The island itself emerged in a star-like form, with 5 great peninsulas reaching toward the sea, as if echoing the cosmic order that had governed its making, and at its heart rose Meneltarma, the pillar of heaven, a sacred mountain left untouched by blade or plough, where the Númenorians would ascend in silence to give thanks to Eru Ilúvatar, the one beyond all powers. For Númenor, though raised by the Valar, was ultimately a testament to a deeper truth, that even the divine stewards of the world were bound by a greater will, and that the destiny of men, unlike that of elves, lay outside the circles of the world, a mystery even the Valar did not fully comprehend. The Edain who came to Númenor did not arrive as conquerors claiming spoils, but as pilgrims crossing the sea under guidance, bringing with them memory, sorrow, and hope. And among them was Elros, brother of Elrond, whose fate marked one of the most profound symbolic moments in the history of Arda, for where his twin chose the immortality of the Eldar, Elros accepted the gift of men, embracing mortality not as a curse but as a calling, and it was he who became the first king of Númenor, ruling under the name Tar Miniatur, establishing a lineage that would stretch across centuries, defined not by conquest but by stewardship, wisdom, and gratitude. In these early days, Númenor was not an empire, nor even a dominant power, but a sanctuary of learning and renewal, where the Númenorians lived long lives, far exceeding those of other men, not as a reward extracted from the Valar, but as a natural consequence of their closeness to the West and their harmony with the design of the world. And crucially, they accepted this longevity without clinging to it, understanding that death was not an injustice to be resisted, but a passage to something beyond the knowledge of the world. And thus, the gift of the West was not merely the island itself, but the state of mind it initially fostered, a culture rooted in humility, reverence, and patience, where knowledge was pursued not to dominate but to understand, where ships were built not for war but for exploration, and where the sea was both a boundary and a calling, reminding the Númenorians of what they were not permitted to seek. Yet embedded within this gift was a tension that would define the entire history of Númenor, for while the Valar had drawn the island closer to Aman, they had also set a clear boundary, the bond that forbade the Númenorians from sailing westward to the undying lands, not as an act of cruelty, but as a necessary safeguard, for Aman was not merely a place but a condition of being incompatible with mortality, and to allow men to enter it would have unraveled the fundamental order of the world, and so Númenor existed in a liminal state, blessed yet constrained, elevated yet limited, and for a time this balance was not only accepted but cherished, for the early Númenóreans understood that to desire immortality was to misunderstand their own nature, and that their strength lay precisely in the freedom granted by their finite lives, Eosa. Freedom that even the immortal elves did not possess, bound as they were to the fate of the world until its end. In this way, the origins of Númenor were inseparable from a moral vision, one in which greatness was measured not by dominion or endurance, but by harmony with the divine order, and the island stood as a living testament to what men could become when they aligned themselves not with fear or ambition, but with trust. And yet, as history would reveal, the very height of Númenor's blessing would cast the longest shadow, for the seeds of its downfall were not sown by external enemies or sudden betrayals, but lay dormant within the gift itself, in the quiet contrast between what men were given and what they were denied, between the beauty they could see across the sea and the fate they could never escape. And though in its beginning Númenor shone as the greatest realm of men that ever was or would be, its story was never meant to be one of endless ascent, but of tragic transformation, a reminder that even the greatest gifts require wisdom to endure, and that the line between reverence and resentment can be crossed not in a single act of rebellion, but in the slow erosion of gratitude, a process that begins not with defiance, but with a question whispered in the heart. Why are we forbidden what others may possess? Númenor in its earliest centuries was not merely an island, but a carefully ordered world, a physical manifestation of harmony, shaped according to principles that reflected the will of the Valar and, beyond them, the deeper design of Eru Ilúvatar. And every aspect of its geography carried symbolic meaning that reinforced the unique place Númenor occupied within Arda. For the island was raised from the sea in a five-pointed star, its great peninsulas extending outward like arms reaching toward the surrounding waters, a form that was neither random nor purely aesthetic, but suggestive of balance, symmetry, and completeness, as if the land itself had been set in place to remind its inhabitants that they lived within an ordered cosmos rather than a world of chance and domination. At the very center of Númenor rose Meneltarma, the Pillar of Heaven, a mountain unlike any other in Middle-earth, not because of its height alone, but because of its sacred function, for it was left untouched by the works of men, unmarred by temple or fortress, and upon its summit the Númenóreans would gather in silence 3 times each year, at Eru-Kiermi, Eru-Laitale, and Eru-Hantale, to give thanks directly to Eru Ilúvatar, without priesthood, sacrifice, or image, an extraordinary practice among mortal peoples that reflected the clarity of Númenorian faith in its early days, where reverence did not require mediation and worship was expressed through humility rather than spectacle. From Meneltarma flowed no rivers and rose no cities, for it was deliberately separated from daily life, a reminder that the highest truths were not to be possessed or reshaped, but approached with restraint. And this spiritual geography radiated outward into the rest of the island, where the land was fertile beyond any known in Middle-earth, yielding crops in abundance and sustaining a population that never knew hunger in its golden age, reinforcing the sense that Númenor existed in a state of blessing, rather than struggle. Along the coast lay great natural harbors, most notably Romena in the east, facing Middle-earth and the rising sun, and Andunia in the west, gazing toward the distant shores of Aman, and it was no accident that these ports became centers of cultural meaning as well as trade and navigation, for Romena embodied Númenor's role as a bridge to the hitherlands, the place from which ships would sail to aid, teach, and befriend the peoples of Middle-earth, while Andunia became associated with memory, longing, and fidelity to the west, its people later known as the Faithful, who would cling most strongly to the original values of Númenor when others turned away. Inland, the city of Armenelos arose as the capital, situated near the foot of Meneltarma, a deliberate placement that symbolized the subordination of royal power to a higher moral order. For the king ruled not from a coastal fortress projecting outward ambition, but from a city anchored beneath the sacred mountain, constantly reminded of the source and limits of Númenor's greatness. This spatial arrangement reinforced a political culture in which authority was understood as stewardship, rather than absolute dominion, and in which the king's legitimacy derived not from conquest or divine right alone, but from fidelity to the purpose for which Númenor had been granted. The Valar themselves did not dwell in Númenor, nor did they rule it directly, but their influence was evident in the clarity of its design, for the island was neither isolated nor fully integrated into the undying lands, existing instead in a liminal space that allowed men to grow in wisdom without erasing the boundaries of their nature. And this balance was further reflected in the rhythms of Númenorian life, which unfolded at a slower pace than that of other men, as their extended lifespan encouraged long memory, patience, and continuity, reducing the urgency that so often drives mortals toward reckless ambition. Númenorian shipcraft flourished not as an instrument of war, but as an expression of curiosity and connection, and their vessels, unmatched in skill and beauty, carried them across the seas not to conquer, but to explore, to chart the coast of Middle-earth, and to renew bonds with the elves, particularly those of Lindon, who maintained close ties with Númenor in its early centuries, exchanging knowledge, lore, and friendship. Yet even in this period of harmony, the geography of Númenor subtly mirrored the tension at the heart of its existence, for while the island was closer to Aman than any mortal land before it, Aman itself remained unreachable, visible only as a memory preserved in lore and song, and this physical proximity without access planted the first seeds of unease, though they lay dormant for generations, for the westward gaze from Andunia across an unbroken sea toward a land of immortality created a contrast between what was known and what was forbidden. And although the early Númenorians accepted this boundary with gratitude, the landscape itself ensured that the question of the West would never be absent from their consciousness. The island's perfection, rather than satisfying all desire, amplified awareness of limits, for Númenor was a place where nearly every earthly need was met, where beauty, knowledge, and prosperity flourished together, leaving mortality itself as the one unalterable constraint, and thus, the shaping of Númenor by the Valar, while intended to provide an ideal environment for men to achieve their highest potential, also created the conditions under which dissatisfaction could eventually take root, for in a land so close to paradise, the remaining distance to true immortality felt all the more unbearable to later generations. In its design, Númenor was therefore both a gift and a test, a space where men were invited to live as they were meant to be, but not as they were tempted to become, and for a long time the island fulfilled its purpose perfectly, standing as the greatest civilization of men, not because of its power, but because of its harmony, its restraint, and its profound alignment with the structure of the world. Yet as history would unfold, the very features that made Númenor extraordinary, the clarity of its order, the visibility of its limits, and the constant presence of the West on the horizon, would also become the silent pressures that shaped its future crisis, proving that even a land crafted in wisdom cannot protect its people from the slow transformation of desire, when gratitude fades and memory grows dim. The early centuries of Númenor were defined not only by the beauty of the island and the wisdom of its design, but by a unique political and cultural order that revolved around the kingship and the extraordinary nature of Númenorian life itself. For the reign of Elrostar Miniatur, first king of Númenor, established patterns that would endure for generations and shaped the very identity of the Dunedain, as his rule embodied the harmony between power and humility that lay at the heart of Númenor's original purpose, and his lineage, descended from both men and elves, symbolized the union of two destinies that had long stood apart, for Elros, unlike his brother Elrond who chose the fate of the Elder, accepted mortality freely, not as a loss but as an affirmation of the gift of men, and in doing so he set a precedent that would define Númenorian attitudes toward life and death for centuries, as the kings who followed him ruled for long spans of time not because they clung to life, but because life itself was abundant, their years stretching far beyond those of other men as a natural consequence of their closeness to the West and their harmony with the world rather than as a reward consciously bestowed or controlled by the Valar. This longevity was accompanied by clarity of mind and strength of body that did not fade quickly with age, allowing Númenorian kings to govern with continuity and foresight, free from the instability that often plagued shorter-lived realms, and as a result Númenor developed a political culture grounded in patience, where decisions were made with an eye toward centuries rather than seasons, and where memory itself became a stabilizing force, as rulers personally remembered the consequences of past actions, rather than relying solely on records or tradition. Yet what distinguished the kings of Númenor in this early era was not merely their lifespan, but their understanding of its limits, for when the time came they would willingly lay down their lives, surrendering the scepter in peace rather than clinging to authority until death overtook them, an act that was not seen as resignation or weakness, but as the final affirmation of their stewardship, demonstrating that true rule lay in service rather than possession. And this voluntary acceptance of death stood in stark contrast to the fear that would later grip Númenor. For in these days mortality was understood not as a curse imposed by the Valar, but as a mysterious freedom granted by Eru Ilúvatar, a destiny that lay beyond the confines of the world and therefore beyond the reach of even the greatest powers within it. The grace of the Dunedain was thus not only physical or intellectual, but moral, expressed in a deep respect for order, tradition, and restraint, as their society valued knowledge, craftsmanship, and exploration, without allowing these pursuits to become instruments of domination, and their mastery of language, lore, and history reflected a desire to preserve understanding rather than to rewrite the past in their own image. The kings themselves acted as exemplars of this ethos, ruling not as divine figures or absolute monarchs, but as first among equals, bound by custom and expectation to uphold the values upon which Númenor had been founded. And their authority, though great, was tempered by the awareness that they ruled a people who remembered the origins of their land, and the purpose for which it had been granted, a memory reinforced by ritual, geography, and shared narrative rather than enforced by fear. The line of Elros endured for many generations, each king inheriting not only the throne but the responsibility to preserve a delicate balance between gratitude for what Númenor was and acceptance of what it was not meant to become. And during this long golden age, the Númenorians remained largely unified in spirit, for the extended lifespan of their rulers and people alike reduced the generational fractures that often drive cultural change, allowing customs and values to be transmitted slowly and coherently, reinforcing stability rather than challenging it. However, even within this period of apparent perfection, subtle shifts began to occur, not yet visible as open dissent but as quiet changes in emphasis, as later generations, though still noble and wise, did not possess the same immediacy of memory as those who had known the Eldar of Beleriand or witnessed the aftermath of the War of Wrath. And while they inherited the benefits of Númenor's grace, they experienced its origins as distant history rather than lived reality. And this gradual distancing from the founding trauma and gratitude of their ancestors began to alter the emotional relationship between the Dunedain and their longevity, for what had once been received as a blessing increasingly came to be measured against the immortality of the elves, whose unending lives appeared, from a Númenorian perspective, both enviable and unjust. Still, during the height of Númenor's early kingship, these tensions remained subdued, held in check by custom, reverence, and the example set by rulers who understood that power, like life itself, was something to be held lightly and relinquished when its time had passed, and thus the grace of the Dunedain in this era lay not in their strength or knowledge alone, but in their ability to live within limits without resenting them, a rare achievement among mortal peoples, and one that would later stand in tragic contrast to the fate that awaited Númenor when this wisdom was forgotten. And the question of why men must die, once accepted with peace, began to be asked not with humility but with defiance. As the centuries passed and the memory of Númenor's founding faded from living experience into inherited tradition, the relationship between the Númenorians and the gift of men began to change in ways that were subtle at first, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly consequential, for while their lives remained long and full by the measure of other mortal peoples, they were no longer content simply to accept mortality as a mysterious destiny beyond understanding, and instead began to compare themselves more openly and more painfully with the immortal elves, whose fate appeared increasingly enviable as Númenor reached the height of its power and knowledge. And it was in this psychological shift that the true shadow over Númenor first emerged, long before any open rebellion or external corruption took root. The ban of the Valar, which forbade the Númenorians from sailing westward to Aman, had originally been accepted as a natural boundary, a necessary condition of the world's order that protected men from a fate incompatible with their nature. But as generations succeeded one another, and the Númenóreans' awareness of their own greatness grew, this prohibition began to feel less like a safeguard and more like an injustice, a reminder not of balance but of exclusion. For Númenor was now the most advanced civilization of men the world had ever known, unrivaled in craftsmanship, learning, and maritime skill, and yet its people were still denied access to the undying lands, where the elves dwelt without fear of death, bound to the life of the world but free from its final separation. This growing sense of grievance was intensified by Númenor's unique position in the world, for the island lay closer to Aman than any other mortal realm, allowing the Númenóreans to gaze westward across an unbroken sea toward a land they could imagine but never reach. And this physical proximity transformed the abstract concept of immortality into a visible absence, a horizon that represented not merely distance but denial. And over time, this denial became a central focus of Númenorian anxiety, particularly among the kings and the learned, who were most acutely aware of the limits of their own lifespan, and most tempted to believe that such limits were unworthy of a people so accomplished. The Valar themselves remained largely silent during this period, neither intervening nor offering renewed explanation for the ban, and this silence, though intended to respect the freedom of men, was increasingly interpreted as indifference or even malice, reinforcing the belief that the powers of the West favored the elves at the expense of men, granting them endless life while consigning the Dundane, despite their loyalty and achievements, to inevitable extinction. And in this reinterpretation of fate, the gift of men was subtly transformed from a privilege into a punishment, a reframing that would prove catastrophic. For once death was perceived not as a doorway to a destiny beyond the world, but as a theft inflicted by higher powers, resentment became inevitable. The Númenóreans began to fear death not as a natural conclusion to a life well lived, but as a looming injustice that robbed them of all they had built, and this fear altered their relationship with time itself. For where earlier generations had embraced patience and long-term stewardship, later ones grew increasingly anxious, driven by the desire to preserve, extend, and secure their achievements against the erasure of mortality. And this shift in attitude manifested culturally in a growing emphasis on monuments, lineage, and historical record, as if by inscribing their names more deeply into the world, the Númenóreans might resist the oblivion they now dreaded. The ban of the Valar, rather than discouraging westward longing, became the focal point of this anxiety, for it symbolized a boundary that could not be crossed through wisdom or merit, only through defiance, and in this way it began to function less as a rule and more as a challenge, inviting speculation about what lay beyond it and whether its authority was truly absolute. And though the kings still outwardly honored the ban, the tone of Númenorian discourse began to change, as questions once asked in private grew bolder and more public, and the idea that the Valar had overstepped their authority by withholding immortality from men gained quiet traction among the elite. Crucially, this transformation did not require the presence of an external deceiver, for it arose organically from Númenor's success itself, from the tension between near perfection and absolute limitation, and it was this internal contradiction that eroded the moral clarity of the Dúnedain, as gratitude slowly gave way to entitlement and reverence to suspicion. Yet the tragedy of this period lies in the fact that the Númenóreans were not entirely wrong in their perception of inequality, for the difference between the fate of elves and men was real and stark, but where wisdom would have acknowledged this difference as a deliberate and meaningful divergence, envy reframed it as an injustice demanding correction, and in doing so it obscured the deeper truth that the immortality of the elves was not a gift without cost, for they were bound to the world and would endure its sorrows until its end, while men were destined for something beyond Arda itself, a mystery that even the Valar did not fully understand. As this perspective was lost, the Númenóreans began to look increasingly inward, measuring themselves against what they lacked, rather than what they were, and this inward turn marked the beginning of their moral decline, for a society that defines itself by denial rather than purpose inevitably seeks to overcome its limits through force or deceit, and though Númenor had not yet fallen, the seed of rebellion had been planted, nurtured by fear, envy, and the quiet conviction that the order of Mu, the world once accepted with humility, might now be challenged, rewritten, or overturned by the will of men themselves. As Númenor's fear of mortality deepened and its resentment toward the ban of the Valar quietly hardened into conviction, the outward expression of Númenorian greatness began to change in character. For the same mastery of the sea that had once been a symbol of curiosity, connection, and benevolent guidance gradually transformed into an instrument of domination, marking the moment when Númenor ceased to see itself primarily as a steward of knowledge, and instead began to act as a power among powers, measuring its worth not by harmony with the world, but by its ability to shape the fate of others. And this shift was neither sudden nor uniform, but unfolded over centuries as Númenorian ships returned to Middle-earth in ever greater numbers, no longer merely as teachers and allies, but increasingly as rulers and masters. In the early days of these voyages, the Númenorians were welcomed as benefactors by many of the lesser peoples of Middle-earth, for their skill, wisdom, and relative restraint stood in stark contrast to the lingering shadows left by Morgoth's dominion. And they taught agriculture, craftsmanship, and governance, bringing stability to regions long scarred by war and neglect. Yet even in these acts of generosity, a subtle hierarchy was established, for the Númenorians, long-lived and immensely capable, could not help but see themselves as superior. And while this sense of superiority initially carried with it a sense of responsibility, it also planted the idea that Middle-earth existed as a field upon which Númenor might exercise its growing power. As time passed and Númenor's population expanded, the island's finite space and resources began to feel restrictive, particularly to a people increasingly anxious about preserving their achievements against the finality of death, and Middle-earth, vast and comparatively undeveloped, came to be viewed not merely as a land of kin and allies, but as an extension of Númenorian destiny, a place to be ordered, exploited, and controlled in the name of progress and security. And thus the Lords of the Sea emerged, Númenorian captains whose authority rivaled that of kings among the coastal regions they governed, bringing with them Númenorian law, language, and customs, often at the expense of local traditions. This imperial expansion was justified internally as a necessary response to chaos and ignorance, a means of imposing order upon a world perceived as lesser and in need of guidance. And yet the moral framework that once restrained Númenor's power was steadily eroded by the practical realities of empire. For maintaining distant settlements and enforcing authority over unwilling populations required coercion, and coercion, once accepted as necessary, became habitual, normalizing the use of force as a tool of governance. The Númenorians' relationship with the peoples of Middle-earth thus underwent a profound transformation, as those who had once looked upon them with admiration began to fear and resent them, and the Númenorians in turn interpreted this resentment as ingratitude, reinforcing their belief that domination was justified by their inherent superiority. And this cycle of power and resentment accelerated Númenor's moral decline. For a civilization that defines itself as a civilizing force often loses the ability to recognize its own capacity for injustice. The wealth extracted from Middle-earth further deepened this corruption, as Númenorian society grew accustomed to abundance not merely as a blessing of the land, but as the result of external exploitation. And this material prosperity fed an increasingly rigid social hierarchy, in which status was measured by proximity to power and access to resources rather than by wisdom or virtue, weakening the cultural foundations that had once bound Númenor together in shared purpose. At the same time, the ideological divide between those who remained faithful to the old values and those who embraced imperial ambition began to widen, though it had not yet crystallized into open conflict, for the kings themselves increasingly favored expansion, seeing in it a means of asserting Númenor's greatness on a global scale, and perhaps even a path toward overcoming the limitations imposed by mortality, as the empire promised continuity beyond individual lives, a legacy that might endure even as generations passed. Yet this pursuit of permanence through domination carried within it a fatal contradiction, for the more Númenor sought to secure its place in the world through power, the more it became entangled in the very world from which men were destined to depart, binding its identity to the material and political structures of Arda, rather than to the transcendent destiny originally promised by the gift of men, and in doing so, it inverted the meaning of its own existence, transforming a realm meant to exemplify acceptance into one defined by resistance to fate. The sea itself, once a symbol of humility and wonder, now reflected this transformation as Númenorian fleets darkened the horizons of Middle-earth, not as harbingers of aid, but as reminders of Númenor's overwhelming might, and the title Lords of the Sea, once descriptive of unmatched skill and courage, came to signify domination rather than mastery, power rather than balance. Thus, by the time Númenor reached the height of its imperial expansion, its moral decline was already well advanced, though still unacknowledged by those who benefited most from the new order, for they saw only strength, wealth, and influence, mistaking these signs of worldly success for proof of righteousness, and failing to recognize that in seeking to rule the world, Númenor had begun to lose itself, setting the stage for an internal fracture that would soon divide the island and determine its ultimate fate. By the time Númenor had fully embraced its identity as a maritime empire, the moral transformation of the island had progressed far enough that it could no longer be contained within private doubts or gradual cultural shifts, and the society that had once been unified by shared memory and purpose fractured along ideological lines that would harden into open hostility, giving rise to the most consequential internal division in Númenorian history. The rift between those later called the Faithful and those who came to be known as the King's Men, a division that was not merely political but existential, rooted in fundamentally opposed understandings of fate, power, and the meaning of Númenor itself. The Faithful were those Númenorians who remained loyal to the original vision of the island, who honored the Valar, revered Eru Ilúvatar, and accepted the gift of men as it had once been understood, not as a punishment but as a destiny beyond the world, and though they were not uniformly opposed to Númenor's presence in Middle-earth, they rejected domination and exploitation, remembering a time when Númenorian ships had brought aid and knowledge rather than chains and tribute. And this memory, preserved most strongly in the western regions of the island, particularly in Andunia, sustained a countercultural identity that resisted the growing ideology of imperial supremacy. In contrast, the King's Men embraced the new narrative of Númenor as a rightful ruler of the world, interpreting its power, longevity, and achievements as evidence that men were destined to replace the Elder Kindred and even to rival the Valar themselves. And under this worldview, reverence for the powers of the West was dismissed as weakness or submission, while obedience to the king and the expansion of Númenorian authority were elevated as supreme virtues. For the King's Men believed that only through strength, unity, and the assertion of dominance could Númenor secure its future against the inevitability of death. This ideological divide was sharpened by language itself, as the King's Men increasingly rejected the use of Elvish tongues, particularly Quenya, which had once been the language of Númenorian royalty and lore, associating it instead with submission to the Valar and nostalgia for a past they now scorned, while the Faithful continued to preserve Elvish speech as a living link to the origins of Númenor and its alliance with the West. And this linguistic shift was more than symbolic, for it represented a deliberate severing of cultural memory, an attempt to redefine Númenor not as a gift received, but as a power self-created. The kings of Númenor, once stewards bound by tradition and restraint, increasingly aligned themselves with the King's Men, not necessarily out of outright hatred for the Valar at first, but because imperial ambition and centralized authority offered tangible benefits in a society now oriented toward power. And as a result, the Faithful found themselves marginalized, excluded from positions of influence, and subjected to growing suspicion, their loyalty to the West reframed as disloyalty to the crown, a dangerous inversion that transformed dissent into treason. This shift marked a profound corruption of Númenorian governance, for authority was no longer exercised to preserve balance and continuity, but to enforce ideological conformity, and laws were increasingly used not to uphold justice, but to silence opposition, with the King's Men controlling the institutions of power and shaping public narrative through fear, propaganda, and the selective rewriting of history. The faithful, though diminished in number and influence, did not disappear, for their identity was sustained not by ambition, but by conviction, and families such as that of Elendil maintained their allegiance to the old ways, even as the cost of doing so rose steadily, enduring social exclusion and political danger rather than abandoning their understanding of Númenor's purpose. And in this quiet resistance lay both the tragedy and the hope of Númenor's final centuries, for the existence of the faithful demonstrated that moral clarity had not vanished entirely, even as the state itself drifted toward catastrophe. The division between faithful and king's men thus transformed Númenor into a kingdom at war with itself, long before any external enemy appeared, eroding trust, unity, and shared identity, and replacing them with suspicion and coercion, and in doing so, it prepared the ground for manipulation from within. For a society that has already abandoned truth in favor of power becomes uniquely vulnerable to deception, especially when that deception promises a solution to its deepest fear. And it was precisely at this moment of internal fracture, when Númenor stood outwardly invincible but inwardly unstable, that a new presence would arrive on the island, one that understood fear, envy, and ambition better than any Númenorian ever could, and would exploit these divisions not by force, but by persuasion, completing the transformation of Númenor's decline from a tragedy of pride into a catastrophe of deliberate self-destruction. When Sauron at last entered Númenor, he did so not as a conqueror dragged in chains, but as a calculated submission that concealed a far greater act of aggression. For after the might of Númenor had grown so overwhelming in Middle-earth that even Sauron's dominion in the east could not withstand it, Ar-Pharazôn marched with such splendor and terror that Sauron judged open war futile, choosing instead to kneel and allow himself to be taken as a prisoner. Fully aware that Númenor's greatest vulnerability lay not in its walls or fleets, but in its unresolved fear of death and its growing resentment toward the powers of the West. And from the moment he set foot upon the island, Sauron began a campaign of corruption that required no armies and shed no blood, for Númenor was already prepared to receive his lies. Outwardly, Sauron presented himself as a humble captive, a servant of the king who possessed vast knowledge of the world and its workings, and Ar-Pharazôn, proud of having humbled the Dark Lord without battle, brought him into his court, believing that Númenor's strength rendered it immune to corruption, a fatal miscalculation that revealed how far the kings of Númenor had drifted from the humility of their ancestors. For in granting Sauron proximity to power, they effectively invited poison into the heart of the realm. Sauron did not challenge Númenorian ideology directly, nor did he demand immediate acts of blasphemy or rebellion, but instead positioned himself as an ally who merely articulated, refined, and justified the beliefs that had already taken root among the king's men, giving intellectual structure to their resentment and framing their fear of mortality not as weakness, but as righteous anger against cosmic injustice. And in doing so, he reframed the narrative of Númenor's history, portraying the Valar not as guardians of order, but as jealous jailers who had conspired to deny men their rightful inheritance, keeping immortality for themselves and their favored elves, while condemning men to inevitable annihilation. This reinterpretation was devastatingly effective, for it transformed doubt into certainty and grievance into ideology. And under Sauron's guidance, the king's men found not only validation but a sense of moral superiority, believing themselves awakened to a truth long concealed by false reverence. And as Sauron's influence grew, he rose swiftly from captive to counselor, and from counselor to chief authority on matters of lore and destiny, his voice shaping royal policy and public belief alike. Central to Sauron's deception was his manipulation of Númenor's relationship with Eru Ilúvatar. For while the early Númenorians had worshipped the One in silence and humility upon Meneltarma, Sauron taught that Eru was distant, indifferent, and unconcerned with the fate of men, and that true power lay instead with Melkor, whom he recast not as the great enemy of the world, but as a misunderstood benefactor who had sought to free men from the tyranny of the Valar. And this inversion of truth allowed Sauron to replace reverence with transaction, offering a religion not of gratitude but of bargaining, in which sacrifice and obedience promised tangible rewards, chief among them the extension of life. Under his influence, a vast temple to Melkor was raised in Armanelos, its smoke darkening the sky and its rituals marking the complete collapse of Númenor's original spiritual order, as human sacrifice was introduced not as an aberration, but as a necessary act to appease a power now believed capable of granting immortality. And through these rituals, fear was institutionalized, binding the population not through shared belief, but through terror, complicity, and the gradual normalization of atrocity. The faithful were persecuted with increasing brutality during this period, accused of treason, stripped of influence, and in some cases put to death. Their refusal to participate in the new cult reframed as rebellion against the king himself, and this persecution served a dual purpose, eliminating opposition while reinforcing the narrative that Númenor's survival depended upon unity under Sauron's doctrine. For a society that sacrifices its dissenters quickly loses the ability to question its own destruction. Ar-Pharazôn himself, once merely proud and ambitious, was utterly transformed by Sauron's counsel, coming to believe that his kingship was not bound by fate or law, but destined to transcend mortality itself, and thus the last restraints on his power vanished, as fear of death eclipsed all other concerns, and the vast resources of Númenor were redirected toward a single objective, the conquest of immortality by force. The true brilliance of Sauron's deception lay in the fact that he did not need to invent Númenor's downfall, but merely to accelerate it, taking the island's existing fears, ambitions, and divisions and aligning them toward a single catastrophic act. And in this way, Númenor fell not because it was weak, but because it was powerful, not because it was deceived against its nature, but because its nature had already been bent away from wisdom. And by the time Sauron's influence was complete, Númenor was no longer the realm shaped by the Valar, but a shadow of itself, driven by terror, sustained by lies, and poised on the edge of an act of defiance that would shatter not only the island, but the very structure of the world. Ar-Pharazôn, the last king of Númenor, stood at the apex of mortal power in Arda, commanding wealth, armies, and fleets on a scale never again achieved by men. Yet it was precisely this unmatched dominance that rendered him most vulnerable to the final corruption of Númenor, for his reign embodied the ultimate convergence of fear, pride, and illusion, transforming the long-simmering anxiety over mortality into a single, catastrophic obsession, the conquest of death itself, an ambition that no Númenorian king before him had dared to pursue so openly or so recklessly. Having seized the throne through force and acclamation rather than lawful succession, Ar-Pharazôn ruled not as a steward bound by tradition, but as an autocrat convinced of his own destiny, and under the influence of Sauron, whose counsel he trusted above all others, he came to believe that his power was not merely political but cosmic, that the might of Númenor, forged through centuries of dominance, entitled him to challenge the very structure of the world and claim immortality as a prize rather than accept it as a mystery denied. Sauron fed this belief with calculated precision, reinforcing Ar-Pharazôn's conviction that the ban of the Valar was not an immutable law, but a strategic deception, a means by which the Valar preserved their own supremacy by withholding the undying lands from men. And in this narrative, Ar-Pharazôn was cast not as a rebel but as a liberator, a king destined to break the chains imposed upon his people and seize for them the life everlasting that had been unjustly denied. And this reframing transformed hubris into perceived duty, allowing Ar-Pharazôn to justify acts of blasphemy and violence as necessary steps toward a higher good. The king's fear of death, once a private anxiety shared by many Númenorians, now became the central organizing principle of the state, shaping policy, culture, and belief as the resources of the island were redirected away from stewardship and learning toward the preparation of an unprecedented military force, a fleet so vast that its construction reshaped the economy and consumed the labor of entire regions, binding Númenor's fate to a single gamble whose failure would mean annihilation. This militarization was accompanied by an intensification of the cult of Melkor, which Sauron positioned as the only remaining path to power over death. And though Ar-Pharazôn himself remained focused on the tangible goal of conquering Aemon, the ritualized violence and human sacrifice carried out in Melkor's name served to sever any remaining spiritual connection between Númenor and Eru Ilúvatar, ensuring that when the final act of defiance was undertaken, it would be done in total moral isolation, without repentance or restraint. As the king's authority became absolute, dissent was eradicated with ruthless efficiency, and the faithful were driven into hiding or exile, their warnings dismissed as cowardice or treason. For in a society gripped by existential terror, moderation appears indistinguishable from betrayal, and the promise of immortality, however illusory, becomes more compelling than any call to humility. The madness of Ar-Pharazôn's ambition lay not merely in its scale, but in its fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of immortality itself, for he believed it to be a possession that could be seized and enforced, a condition of the body rather than a destiny of the soul, and this reduction of eternal life to a political objective stripped it of all meaning, transforming what had once been a profound mystery into a crude commodity, to be taken by force if not granted willingly. In this final phase of Númenor's decline, the king came to view time itself as an enemy to be conquered, and the passing years as an insult to his authority, a perspective that inverted the original Númenorian reverence for patience and continuity, replacing it with frantic urgency and denial. As if by acting decisively and violently enough, Ar-Pharazôn might outrun the fate he so deeply feared. The fleet that assembled under his command was therefore not merely a military instrument, but a symbol of Númenor's complete moral collapse, a physical manifestation of the belief that no boundary was beyond challenge and no law beyond revision. And as it gathered in the western harbors, darkening the sea with its countless ships, it represented the culmination of centuries of internal decay, a final rejection of the gift of men in favor of a lie that promised eternity but guaranteed destruction. Even Sauron, architect of this corruption, recognized the inevitability of what was to come, for he understood that the Valar would not respond with force, and that the ultimate consequence of Ar-Pharazôn's defiance would lie beyond their authority, and thus he withdrew from the fleet, remaining behind in Númenor, fully aware that the king's madness would summon a judgment fog, greater than any Númenorian power could withstand, and so, driven by fear masquerading as destiny, Ar-Pharazôn prepared to sail west, believing himself on the verge of ultimate triumph, when in truth he was about to bring not only his own ruin, but the end of Númenor itself, and with it the irreversible transformation of the world. When Ar-Pharazôn at last set sail toward the west, leading the greatest armada ever assembled by mortal hands, the fate of Númenor passed beyond the reach of all counsels, warnings, and deceptions, for this act of defiance marked not merely a rebellion against the Valar, but an open challenge to the fundamental order established by Eru Ilúvatar himself. And, in that moment, the long tragedy of Númenor reached its irreversible turning point, as the king's fleet, so vast that the sea itself seemed constrained by its presence, advanced toward Aman in a display of power meant to intimidate even the immortal, and yet, in doing so, revealed the ultimate emptiness of Númenorian ambition, for the force that had subdued Middle-earth was utterly meaningless before the authority it now sought to overthrow. As the ships approached the shores of the undying lands, the Valar did not respond with battle or resistance, for they had been forbidden to act directly against the children of Ilúvatar. And recognizing that the authority of Arda itself had been violated, they laid down their governance of the world and appealed instead to Eru Ilúvatar, surrendering the fate of Númenor to the one who alone possessed the power to alter the fabric of creation. And it was in response to this appeal that the downfall unfolded, not as an act of wrath born of anger, but as a decisive reassertion of cosmic order against an existential transgression. The world was changed in a single moment, as the seas rose in towering waves and the land itself trembled, and Númenor, once the most blessed realm of men, was swallowed by the ocean in a cataclysm so complete that no trace of the island remained, its cities, temples, fleets, and people consumed in a final judgment that erased not only a civilization, but the illusion upon which it had been built. For the island that had been raised by grace was now destroyed by defiance, completing the arc of its tragic destiny. Ar-Pharazôn and his warriors, who had set foot upon the shores of Aman in their madness, did not gain the immortality they sought, but were buried beneath falling hills, trapped alive within the caves of the Forgotten, where they would remain until the end of the world, a fate that embodied the ultimate irony of their ambition. For in seeking to escape death, they were denied even the release of it, imprisoned in timeless darkness as a living testament to the futility of rebellion against fate. The destruction of Númenor was accompanied by a transformation of the world itself, as the once flat earth was bent into a sphere. Aemon was removed from the physical world and set beyond the reach of mortal navigation, and the straight road was established as the sole path by which the elves might still sail west, ensuring that never again would men come so close to the undying lands. And in this reshaping of reality, the error that had tempted Númenor was rendered impossible, not as a punishment alone, but as a safeguard against the repetition of such a catastrophe. Within Númenor itself, the final moments were marked by terror and despair, as the sea consumed the island from its edges inwards, sweeping away the great ports and cities that had once symbolized Númenorian power, and even the sacred heights of Meneltarma were engulfed, though it is said that those who fled there in repentance were granted a swift and merciful death, a final acknowledgement that even at the end, humility retained meaning, while the Temple of Melkor, once the center of terror and sacrifice, was destroyed utterly, its blasphemies silenced beneath the waves. Sauron, who remained in Númenor during the cataclysm, was stripped of the ability to assume a fair form, his body destroyed in the destruction of the island, and though his spirit survived, bound still to Middle-earth, he emerged diminished, unable ever again to deceive the free peoples through beauty or persuasion alone, a consequence that revealed the limits of his own manipulation. For though he had engineered Númenor's fall, he too was caught within its judgment, losing much of what had made his corruption so effective. The Akallabêth, the downfall, thus stands not merely as a tale of destruction, but as a cosmological turning point, the moment when the relationship between mortals, immortals, and the divine was irrevocably altered. For after Númenor, the world became smaller, more constrained, and more distant from the presence of the sacred, and men were left to face their destiny without the visible nearness of the West, a loss that echoed across all later ages as a deepening of separation and sorrow. Yet even in this overwhelming catastrophe, the narrative of Númenor is not one of absolute annihilation, for the island's destruction, though total, did not erase its legacy, and the story of what Númenor had been and what it had become survived in memory, warning, and consequence, shaping the history of Middle-earth long after the waves had closed over the last remnants of its towers, and it is in the survival of this legacy, carried by those who had refused to abandon the old ways, that the final meaning of the downfall is revealed. For Númenor did not fall because it was weak, but because it forgot why it had been strong, and in seeking to escape death, it lost not only its future, but its past, leaving behind a transformed world haunted by the shadow of its greatest failure. Though Númenor itself was utterly destroyed in the Akallabêth, erased from the world in fire and flood, its story did not end beneath the waves, for the downfall, catastrophic as it was, did not annihilate all who remembered the true purpose of the island, and from the wreckage of that lost civilization emerged a remnant whose survival ensured that Númenor's legacy would endure, transformed but not extinguished, shaping the history of Middle-earth for millennia to come, as the Faithful, led by Elendil and his sons Isildur and Anarion, escaped the destruction and were carried eastward by storm and providence to the shores of Middle-earth, bearing with them not only their lives but the memory, culture, and moral inheritance of Númenor as it had once been meant to exist. These survivors did not arrive as conquerors in the manner of the later Númenorian Empire, but as exiles dispossessed and humbled, and this change in circumstance profoundly altered the way in which Númenorian identity was expressed, for stripped of the island that had symbolized their greatness, the Dunedain were forced to confront the meaning of their heritage without the material abundance and divine proximity that had once sustained it. And in this crucible of loss, the truest elements of Númenor's original vision were preserved, not through dominance, but through endurance, restraint, and remembrance. Elendil, acknowledged as High King of the Dunedain in Middle-earth, established the twin realms of Arnor in the north and Gondor in the south, realms founded not as replicas of Númenor's imperial phase, but as attempts to recover its earlier harmony, balancing power with humility and authority with service. And though these kingdoms would never rival Númenor in sheer splendor, they carried forward its highest achievements in governance, law, architecture, and lore, embedding them within the fabric of Middle-earth rather than imposing them from above. Gondor, in particular, emerged as the most direct heir of Númenorian civilization, its cities, monuments, and institutions reflecting both the grandeur and the caution born of catastrophe, as the White Tree, descended from Nimloth of Númenor, stood in Minas Ithil and later Minas Tirith as a living symbol of continuity and loss, reminding the Dunedain that their strength derived not from conquest or defiance, but from fidelity to a purpose larger than themselves. Yet the shadow of Númenor's fall lingered heavily over these realms, for the survivors carried not only wisdom, but trauma, and the knowledge that even the greatest of men could be undone by pride, and fear shaped their approach to power, instilling a persistent anxiety about decline, fading, and the passage of time. An anxiety that manifested in the gradual waning of Númenorian longevity, as the Dunedain of Middle-earth lived ever shorter lives with each passing generation, a visible sign that the extraordinary grace once granted to Númenor had been diminished, leaving behind a people caught between memory and mortality. This fading was not merely biological but cultural, as the long arc of history saw Arnor fragment and fall, its unity eroded by internal division and external pressure, while Gondor endured but gradually retreated from its former borders, its vigilance strained by the return of Sauron and the persistent weight of defending a world that no longer remembered the lessons Númenor had paid for with its existence. Sauron himself, though diminished by the downfall, remained Númenor's most enduring legacy of failure, for his survival ensured that the corruption which had destroyed the island would continue to threaten Middle-earth, and the wars of the Second and Third Ages can be read as echoes of Númenor's unresolved conflict, as the Dunedain repeatedly confronted the same temptation to assert power through domination rather than stewardship, a temptation that culminated most tragically in Isildur's refusal to destroy the One Ring, an act that mirrored Númenor's earlier inability to relinquish power even when its cost was clear. Yet despite these failures, the legacy of Númenor was not solely one of warning and decline, for its memory also preserved a vision of what men could be at their best, a vision that endured through fragments of lore, architecture, and lineage, ultimately finding its fullest expression not in empire, but in renewal, as the return of the king in the War of the Ring represented not a restoration of Númenorian dominance, but a reclamation of its original humility, as Aragorn, descendant of Elendil, accepted his kingship not as a means of defying death, but as a duty to serve a world that would outlast him. In this way, Númenor's story completes a vast and tragic cycle, beginning with a gift freely given and ending with a legacy painfully earned. For while the island itself was lost forever, its meaning was not, and the rise and fall of Númenor became one of the central moral narratives of Middle-earth, a reminder that greatness divorced from gratitude becomes self-destruction, and that the true measure of a civilization lies not in its ability to endure indefinitely, but in its willingness to accept its limits with wisdom, preserving what is good even as it passes away, so that from the ashes of failure something truer and more enduring might yet arise.